Hammerstrike, for the uninformed, is a debuff that the majority of the Destiny 2 community has largely forgotten about. A small explanation of what a debuff is that it is an effect you can put onto an enemy to make them weaker, thus making them take more damage for a short period of time. These shouldn't get confused with buffs that increase the player's damage. If this confuses you, all you really need to know is that the general rule of thumb is you can stack one buff and one debuff into a damage phase. Cool? Cool. When I say that this particular debuff has been forgotten about, I think it would actually be safer to say it has been sidelined for other debuffs. There are quite a few in the game, but I'm only going to focus on what I consider the 4 main debuffs: Tether, Tractor Cannon, Divinity, and of course Hammerstrike. Let's start with Tether. Tether is possibly the most versatile debuff in the game due to its ability to be used at any range. Here's my problem with it though. You are forced to use your super ability. Hunters have, without question, the best anti-boss super in the game in Golden Gun with Celestial Nighthawk. Having to forego that in exchange for a debuff is never fun. Granted, I do think the trade-off is worth it, but having a Celestial will always make your DPS situations easier, especially for speedrunners. Second is Tractor Cannon. This debuff is almost as forgotten about as Hammerstrike, but in my opinion, is harder to redeem. Yes, Tractor Cannon, unlike any other debuff in the game, can be reapplied as often as the user likes, assuming you have ammo. The problem with Tractor Cannon is 1, you always have to be close, 2, you lose your heavy slot, and 3, you lose your exotic slot. Don't get me wrong, Tractor's still a really good gun in D2, but it is arguably the hardest to implement properly due to the user losing 2 of their best DPS options in the heavy weapon and exotic weapon. Third is Divinity. Divinity adds a giant crit spot that does 2 things. 1, it adds the expected 30% off for the entire team, and 2, the huge bubble makes it very easy to shoot otherwise very hard to hit headshots. While a very strong debuff, it has 3 major problems. It requires 1 person to miss an entire damage phase. 2, it doesn't always give a 30% debuff. Against some bosses, it merely gives a boost to the body shot damage, or somewhere in between, not necessarily a 30% to overall damage. And 3, if your teammates aren't doing really good damage, then the 30% debuff isn't mathematically worth the loss of a 6th teammate. And that is assuming you're in a raid. If you're in a 3-man fire team, a la an Empire Hunt or Nightfall, then the Divinity is actually a detriment to your damage. And no, I'm not counting the ease of a crit or the staggering potential for champions. I'm simply talking about raw damage output right now. Don't get me wrong, I love Divinity, more than most, but it's very situational and sometimes downright useless. Lastly, we have Hammerstrike. It's very simple. You run and punch your target, and then you have 6 seconds to blast the crap out of them. Hammerstrike's biggest flaw is, obviously, you have to be within melee range. And yes, there are certain areas where that's impossible, a la Sanctified Mind and Taniks. But Hammerstrike has a trait unlike any other debuff in the game. It is the only debuff that doesn't use your super, your heavy slot, or use up an exotic weapon. It is tied to your melee ability. This frees up your ability to use any weapon you want, so you can be the 3rd or 6th person doing damage, while also giving your team the 30% extra damage. If you pair this with the Hollowfire Heart exotic, you get near infinite charges. No, I'm not joking. Divinity might be the best overall debuff, particularly for targets with longer time to kill or are farther away. But Hammerstrike to me is best when you're damaging something close and it needs to be killed fast. Especially with Lament, and swords in general really, currently being the strongest weapons in the game for quick DPS to most bosses, Hammerstrike might be the best debuff in the game currently. Destiny is definitely trying to broaden its playstyle, so there are multiple ways to come at a situation. But to me, Hammerstrike, while one of the oldest, is still one of the best debuff options in the game. Go give it a shot. Alright Guardians, that's enough for one day. See ya.